Hey everyone, thanks for joining me on this video. This video I'm going to go through two different surfaces. This is the pastel paper and the pastel mat for soft pastels. So stick with me, I'm going to go through the differences, which one I prefer, and at the end I'll do a little drawing the same so that you can see the comparison between the two and why I prefer the one over the other, especially if you're starting out with pastels and you're not sure which one to go with, then this might help you along. So if you enjoy the video, please don't forget to like, give me a subscribe so you can see more, and let's get into it. Okay, so this one is a pastel paper, and this one is a Clairefontine pastel matte paper. So I think this is a Dealeroni pastel paper, and this is a Clairefontine pastel matte paper. Now here we're going to see the difference, and there are other papers. There's the velvet papers, and we'll look at those again, but I must say that I always really prefer this pastel matte, and you'll see why. So we can see that with the pastel paper we do have some tooth on there. It is a little bit textured, but it's not as smooth and a continuous texture as this pastel matte paper. You can sometimes see little lines here, and also the main thing is you can't build up as many layers, which means it's much harder to add details. Now that's not saying that there isn't a place for pastel paper. There certainly is in certain drawings. I also find that sometimes in some landscape drawings it's really good for that, but for animal drawings and portrait drawings, drawings where you need detail, I much prefer this one. You will see here that as I put a colour on, so we can put this colour on here, we can see the patternage here, and if we do the same here, it pulls more pastel, but it's more smooth. So then when we want to blend them, we'll see here that we can blend this one, and although it does blend quite nicely, it obviously takes a lot of the pastel off the paper because it's a smoother paper, so it doesn't hold the tooth. Whereas on the pastel mat we can get a much more even blend and a nice smooth finish. So initially it's not smooth, but then it is, and here we can still see the lines. So we can add more layers to this one. So we wanted to add a darker layer on the one side, we can do that, and we'll do the same here. And now I'm using the same pressure and the same piece of pastel stick. I'm using the same blending stump. We'll start on this one, we'll darken this side, and we'll darken this side, and obviously you can see the vast difference here. We can smooth that in nicely, and that just pretty much looks a little bit darker, so we'd have to add more darker brown onto this side, a little bit harder, a bit heavier, just to get that difference. And then obviously we've got the issue then of the pattern in the paper. There are different papers and they'll have different patterns, but generally a pastel matte paper will have some kind of striation in the paper. The other thing is, so if we wanted to add another layer, so we wanted to add some orange to the edge, we can again blend that in and blend that in, but you can see the vast difference here. Okay, so having a look at that, we're going to now draw two eyes. So I'm going to try and keep these eyes as identical as possible. I'm going to draw one next to the other using exactly the same techniques, same pencils, and then you can see the difference for yourself. Okay, so we're going to draw these. This is the pastel mat, this is the pastel paper. I'm going to draw them, try and keep them as the same as we can. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to darken up the edge here. Now this is a very quick drawing just to get an idea, so Perhaps some of the techniques I use quickly here won't necessarily be the techniques to draw an eye. But I just want to sort of show you quickly the difference in the papers. And I'll try and do the same on each side to keep it as consistent as possible. As you can see here already, you can see the pattern of the paper. Now there might be some times when this is actually a good thing and this sort of enhances your picture depending on what type of artwork you're looking for. Well, this one's probably a bit better in the shape. We'll have a look at that. This is the artist in me now wanting to get it correct, but just looking to see what we can draw here. I'm just going to clean that bit up a bit as well. Okay, so then we can come and start to use our blending sticks and stumps and things. And this is where you start to see the difference. So I'm going to blend that in. And as you can see, it blends in very smoothly. And it leaves a lot of that sort of pastel pigment and pastel on the paper, and you can blend it around, smooth it out, and it's sort of quite forgiving, really. You can use the blending stump to draw with. And on here, again, it does blend it, but it's going to leave those lines where you've got the ridges of the paper. Now there'll be different papers with different patterns in. Some might be, not sure if there's any sort of hot press type of smoother papers, but these are the ones that I generally come across the most. Okay. Now I'm going to put some of this white highlight in, as I would normally do, where I want the lighter colours to come through. I just put a little bit in normally, just to make sure that the colours above are highlighted. So here I'm going to just speed things up a little bit because we don't want to focus too much on any techniques here that we're doing. We're just trying to see the difference between these papers. I do have eye videos if you're looking for them. I also have many more in-depth tutorials over on my Patreon. If you would be interested in actually learning, then I've got lots of different videos over on there that go into real time and much more detail. There's lots of tutorials, new ones added every week, and you're not in any contract, so you can cancel it any time, come go as you please. So what I'm doing here is I'm just drawing these eyes in as quick as I can, just trying to keep them as similar as I can keep them. I'm not using any particular reference picture here, so the one is slightly a different shape than the other, but generally I'm trying to keep everything the same. I'm using the same techniques and the same pencils. So here I'm just darkening the irises with the blacks. I'm putting in a brown here. So as the brown's going on the Pastelmat, it's sort of going on a little bit thicker, and you can see that it's deeper. And when I put it on this pastel paper, again, it's going on similarly, but you can see these striations on the one, so it's a little bit more uniformed on the Pastelmat. Okay, so as we come in now with our slightly lighter colours, this is a reddy brown. I'm going to put this in around here, and I can put some on top of the black and then the brown there, and it sort of blends in, whereas here, so far it's looking similar, but when we blend it with a blending stump, we'll start to see that it's a little bit more saturated on the pastel paper. It's not terrible, and it's perfectly doable. It's just you have to work a little bit harder as we go through the drawing. So we're going to add this orange now just to lighten up this area. It doesn't quite help here that I've got the eye in slightly different shape, but you'll be able to see the final outcome. And already we can see that the Pastelmat paper is a bit of a smoother drawing. And I'm not using any different techniques, any different papers. I'm just blending that in, and it blends in nicely. Whereas this is, although it blends, it leaves a lot of harder pastel on the ridges of that paper. Now I'm just going to bring in some fur around the edges and again on the top. And blend that in. And as you can see, it blends in quite smoothly here. And I'm just going to put in a little bit of blue on the white. And again here, a bit more blue. And smooth that in with a blending stump. And now we can see where it's a lot deeper, a lot richer on the Pastelmat than it is on the pastel paper. Just going to add some darker fur on the top of this eye here. And we can start to see the details that we can add on the Pastelmat compared to the details on the pastel paper. So the pastel paper there is very much focused on having the pattern of the paper showing. So you are drawing onto paper, and it's sort of evident that you are showing and drawing something on a paper surface. Whereas with the Pastelmat, you're not so much. Like I said before, there's very often times where you want that to be, you want it to be more of a sketchy drawing feel, and that's when that Pastelmat paper comes into its own. And you can get similar effects, it's just sometimes you have to work it a little bit differently and use a few different techniques. Now we're going to darken the edges of this eye, and this is where you'll start to see the Pastelmat come into its own. So we can get a darker, deeper sort of colour on the Pastelmat. We can deepen those colours and bring a bit more depth to the drawing with fair amount of ease. Whereas if we do the same to this pastel paper, again, it's going on top of the blended colour underneath, so it's not quite as dark. It's a little bit more sort of a slightly overexposed version. And we can bring in these darker colours here. And here where we try to smooth that dark area around the eyeball, where it gives it a bit more shape, it's a little bit harder to do. Bring in some highlights and they can quite easily show here. So we'll just add in these white highlights now. A few details, a couple of highlights in the eye. And then we'll do the same on this side. And you can see straight away that it's a little bit harder to get these details to show. And they're a little bit more muddy now because we're moving the layers around more. There's less grip from the paper. Whereas on this Pastelmat side, there's still plenty of grip. We can smooth those in quite nicely. They give a nice, they hold the pastel well. Whereas these on the pastel side, pastel paper side, they sort of blend and they sort of become a little bit saturated and muddy. So you don't get those details. It's harder to work on. And again, we can add more layers. We can lighten this area up quite easily, give some highlights on the eye. Whereas here we have to press much harder on the pastel paper now to try and add any white layers. And I'm just going to add some reflections of fur and eyelids in here, darken up the iris, darken up some of the areas because I can still add plenty of pastel to that paper. And here again, it's a little bit harder to work. We're not getting that depth. We can try and work in some more pastel, but it doesn't get that smooth effect. And now as I'm working these pastel pencils on the Pastelmat, they're blending in as we go, whereas on the paper it's harder to actually get them to blend in the right sort of way. So there's not a smoother blend. Sort of use a blending stump and move it around a bit. We can add more layers again on the Pastelmat. You can add some yellow and it sort of will blend in. Whereas on the pastel paper, it's a little bit harder to get that sort of smooth transition. We can deepen this eye and deepen these colors even more. And every time we add more layers onto the pastel paper, we're sort of starting to take layers off because it's sort of saturated. It's all it can hold. Whereas the pastel matte paper can just keep holding more and more layers. Add some highlights. Harder to add highlights now on this one. These will blend in lovely, whereas these are a little bit harder to blend in. And so there we have it. Here we got our pastel paper. So with a bit more work, we could probably get exactly how we want it, but it's a little bit easier to manage with the pastel matte paper. It's a little bit more forgiving, where we get a little bit smoother transitions and deeper colors. So it's really up to you and what type of drawing you're looking to create. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. It was a good example to see the differences, and obviously now I can tell you that obviously I do prefer the Clairefontine Pastelmat. There are probably some other brands out there, but they're that's the one I go with. It is a little bit more expensive. However, if you buy it in packs, so if I was going to start, I would probably practice by buying a pack of 5 or 10 A4 or slightly bigger sheets off Amazon or something like that, and then I would sort of practice on that and go from there. You can then buy the larger sheets like I do. I buy, I think they're the 50 by 70 sheets, and you can cut them up into the sizes that you need. They are a little bit more expensive, but they will give you much better results. It's much more important to have a good pastel surface than it is really the quality of the pastel pencils that you use. I'm not endorsed by them in any way. That's just the brand that I always buy. That's the one I use. I have used some velvet ones, velvet papers, but we can go on to those in another video. I prefer them. They give you, I think, a better, deeper, more detailed drawing. So if I was going to start drawing, I did start drawing in pastels using pastel papers and I moved on. And I think if I was going to start or give myself advice now, I definitely use the Pastelmat to start with, because it gives you a little bit more confidence when you actually end up with something that you enjoy doing, and you don't have to go through all of the rigmarole of trying to make something happen from something that isn't going to work. But it is a little bit more expensive, but spend the money on the paper more than the pencils, especially at the beginning. The pencils, as long as they're pastel pencils and they're of a decent enough quality, they will generally be the same when you're starting out. It's definitely the surface that you want to concentrate on. So I hope that's been helpful for you. Don't forget to give me a like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out my Patreon.